All right, hello everyone, and welcome on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences. I am Claire Davison. I'm an engagement officer in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'll be your moderator for today. So thank you so much for joining us for book club. Today we will discuss Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, which the title was selected by Department of English leaders and faculty. So a huge thank you to Hannibal Hamlin, professor in the Department of English, for sharing his expertise with us today. Hannibal will get us started with some opening remarks about Wolf Hall, excuse me, and then we'll open up the conversation to all of your questions and comments. So Hannibal, take it away.
Thanks, Clara. I'm happy to be here and happy to join the discussion. And I hope I've got a few interesting things to offer. And then I look forward to hearing all the questions that you all have. I thought I'd start out, I don't have anything like a lecture on this, but I thought I'd start out by addressing a couple of big questions that came into Clara at least earlier in the week. And they're actually the questions that occurred most to me when I was thinking about this. And they're questions that, by no means am I offering sort of like complete answers. And so they're things that we can certainly continue to talk about, but they might generate some more ideas. The first has to do with history. This is a historical novel. It's based on a historical period that actually is extremely popular for historical fiction for one reason or another. That in itself is an interesting question. Why is it that the story of the Tudors in the 16th century has generated so many novels and television series and films and plays and continues to? But the history itself, just to address a little bit of that, it's well documented. It's a very active field for historians. But there are some controversial issues. This is the nature of history. It's not as if there is a single history that everybody agrees on that one can go to. Very often, especially for periods like this that are complicated, you have historical debates. The historical term for this is historiography, the sort of the record of various historical arguments put together. And the pendulum may swing one way or another as to which of these is more persuasive, but it's seldom the case that you suddenly sort of settle on things. So for instance, our central character, Thomas Cromwell, is a figure of great controversy. Traditionally, he's been seen as really a dark figure. Stephen Greenblatt, the famous American Shakespearean scholar, likened him to Beria, the head of Stalin's secret police, which may be a little harsh, but he does have that sort of reputation, the sort of strong man behind the scenes, the hatchet man for Henry VIII, who's himself got plenty of darkness. And obviously, Hilary Mantel is pushing back against that to some significant degree. Another controversial figure involved in all of this is Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife. Henry's famous for having 6 wives. What is it? Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Anne Boleyn is the second one, the first to be beheaded. And part of the controversy about her has to do with, well, how she's represented. Is she a relative innocent in all of this? A victim, another victim of Henry's terror, or is she in some sense partly at least responsible for her own fate? Obviously, the charges against her seem alarming. Well, it's hard not to believe that they're somewhat trumped up, especially the bit about witchcraft, and we may be a little skeptical too about the charge of incest. But it's not impossible that the charges of adultery have some legitimacy, especially if you think about the nature of the Tudor court, about Anne's growing up in France, about the nature of Henry himself at this point. Whether that affects our position on her one way or another is another question. And another figure who's very much involved in the controversial debates about history in this period is Thomas More. Actually, Thomas More is probably the most controversial figure in Hilary Mantel's novels. He dies, of course, at the very end of, spoiler alert, I hope everybody's finished, at the end of Wolf Hall. She goes on to write 2 more novels, but More is the sort of climactic, his death, his execution is the climax of this novel. For Catholics, More is a saint. We actually have a More house on campus, and Thomas More is a Catholic saint. He's revered as in all ways as heroic, and in fact, his execution is seen as a kind of martyrdom, resisting the radical, heretical moves of Henry and his churchmen and Cromwell, who supports him, and going to the block on an issue of essentially the highest matter, salvation history, maintaining the authority of God and church over that of the king. Because Hilary Mantel sort of shifts the moral valences somewhat, giving us a much more interesting and positive Cromwell, though we can talk about that, and a much darker, more suspect Thomas More, there's been a lot of backlash, especially from Catholic scholars and readers. The historian Eamon Duffy, who's a major Catholic historian in the period, has written about this, and there are a number of articles in Catholic journals. Even it's interesting, you know, that you might think this is something confined to the 16th century, but people still bandy about words like heresy and blasphemy, you know, accusing Hilary Mantel of the same kinds of things they would accuse Cromwell and Henry VIII of. That you know, so that the misrepresentation of Thomas More in this novel is not just a historical error or a sign of bias, but in fact supporting a heretical position, which is a little startling. One of the key questions in terms of the representation of More has to do with his, I think Mantel pretty clearly argues that More is himself guilty of torturing heretics. And Eamon Duffy, certainly, who is an eminent historian, argues that there's just not evidence for that. And he's not the only one. There are Protestant historians and those who don't have a confessional bias who make the same arguments, that the evidence for More himself torturing Protestants is slim at best and possibly non-existent. At the same time, More certainly was viciously opposed. Well, vicious, that's the wrong word. Vehemently, shall we say, opposed to heretics. And I don't think had any qualms about their torture or execution, whether he himself participated in that or not. And all of this really opens up the very biggest questions about this period in history, having to do with the Protestant Reformation and whether that's seen as a good thing or a bad thing. Obviously, if you're a Catholic, it's not a good thing. If you're a Protestant, it is. Hopefully, you know, it seems to me the very best of historians are able to put those sorts of polemical positions to one side and examine the history in its own rights. But these issues do come up and bubble up in the context of discussing Mantel's novel. The other big question, and I realize that we can come back to lots of the historical arguments, but the other big question, it seems to me, is what exactly is a historical novel? It's an odd sort of beast. It tends to get lumped in with various other types of novels that are called genre novels or genre fiction, you know, so you have sci-fi and fantasy and young adult and whatever else you want to call it. Historical novels are not serious fiction, although there are some examples and have been for some time. I mean, the novels of Walter Scott are part of the traditional literary canon, and there are other historical novels that have been revered or admired. Charles Dickens, for instance, his novel Tale of Two Cities is set during the French Revolution. His principal characters are fictional, but it takes place during real time and the history is part of it. So what is a historical novel and what is historical fiction? You might almost think that it's a kind of oxymoron, that the two terms are in fact directly opposed to and contradictory of each other. I don't think that's true, though, the more we think about it. For one thing, in the period I spend most of my time studying, which is, in fact, the period that Mantel's writing about, the 16th and 17th century, the word history hasn't yet fully diverged from the word story. So even though there are historians who are writing history as we would recognize the term, history can also mean simply story, the tale of something or other. And so history does in fact have a relationship to the kinds of tales or stories that are told in works of narrative fiction. And even when you're writing history, properly speaking, we may not recognize it all the time, but historians are constantly making things up. And that's, of course, what fiction means, from the Latin word to make, facere. In order to create a coherent narrative out of all the bits and bobs of evidence and data that historians discover, you have to create something. You have to develop character. You have to elaborate words. You have to set scenes. You have to fill in all sorts of blanks that make the historical narrative more coherent than simply a table of statistics. So that there is, in the writing of history, a strong element of fiction. On the other hand, novels, even non-historical novels, whatever that is, it's not really a term, are packed full of history, at least in the sense that they're based on reality, real stuff. Of course, if you get into the realm of fantasy and science fiction, you depart from that a little bit, but not entirely. Otherwise, novels wouldn't be comprehensible. A novelist roots whatever story is being told in some kind of a real world that we can recognize. And often that real world is full of actual historical data or stuff. Think about Herman Melville's Moby Dick, for instance, right? He has to know something about Nantucket. He has to know an enormous amount about whales and the whaling industry and sailing and seafaring, so that there is, in fact, quite a lot of history in his novel, even though nobody would call it a historical novel. But then we have these things that are called historical novels, and what exactly does it mean? There's a greater proportion of history. Is that what we mean? Is it a question of where the fictionalizing occurs? I mentioned Tale of Two Cities. The principal characters in that Dickens makes up. It's set during the French Revolution, but it's fictional characters in that world. Is a historical novel one where, like Hilary Mantel, she's actually using historical figures as her main agents? I don't know whether that's key. It is true, though, that historical fiction is not a new genre, as I said. It goes back even to the Renaissance. If you know Shakespeare's plays, a good chunk of them are history plays, and that was a very popular genre, especially in the 1580s, 1590s, but later on too. So he writes plays about the Wars of the Roses and about King John. He writes plays about Roman history, like Antony and Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, and those were very popular on the Renaissance stage. He's drawing on historical material, but he manipulates it in various ways. And that's probably something we'll end up talking about, that manipulation. Is it accurate? Does it need to be accurate? What do we do if it's not accurate? I was thinking too, though, that even apart from plays and novels, like Booker Prize winning novels, we watch a lot of movies and television shows that are essentially historical. You think of Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, or films about various sort of major issues in American history, like Selma, or the popular TV series about the recent monarchy in Britain, The Crown, and various other films about more recent British monarchs, or even something like, something you wouldn't necessarily think of as a historical film, but Bohemian Rhapsody, right? About that popular band. It's a historical film. And yet, so it's a work of fiction, but it's based on history in the same way that Hilary Mantel's novel is. Just a few more questions, and I realize I'm taking too much time, but I was reading around trying to see what people had written about historical fiction, and it turns out not very much, which is interesting. I found a lot of things, a lot of articles and pieces written about the value of historical fiction in teaching. So that it seems as if some people think that historical novels are a great way to introduce, especially younger students, to history, sort of like the spoonful of sugar approach. Although I don't know. Is that a really good idea? Certainly that's not really what Wolf Hall is all about, since it has a very large, active, interested adult readership. And I don't think people are going to these books in order to learn the history. They're going to them because they're powerful novels. even though they're about history. And I should say that at least a couple of the best reviewers of the novel that I've found, one of them, Dermot McCulloch, who's another great historian of the period, who's written a major, actually since Mantel's Wolf Hall was produced, he's published a massive biography of Thomas Cromwell, arguing that in fact, Cromwell really was rather closer to Hilary Mantel's version than people had thought. And then also the New Yorker critic, James Wood, both of them argue that, that really Mantel's novels are best thought of not so much as historical fiction, but as fiction, possibly great fiction or successful fiction that happens to use as its primary material history and historical characters. I don't know whether that's a distinction that's useful or that we'll agree on, but at any rate, that should be enough to hopefully generate some further questions, and I'm interested to hear what you all have to say.
Thank you so much, Hannibal. Yes, that's a great start to the conversation here. Again, everyone feel free to submit your questions or comments. You can use the Q&A if you want to type, or you can click raise hand if you'd like to speak. Our first question is from Nancy, and she asked, why is it called Wolf Hall? None of the action takes place there.
That's an interesting question. I suppose it partly depends whether you're thinking about this novel in itself or thinking of the series as a whole. I mean, Wolf Hall serves as a kind of teaser at the end of this first novel, giving you a sense of like what's coming next, you know, and we have also Jane Seymour, who's sort of lurking around. She's an innocent character, but we know the history. I think this is an interesting feature of the historical novel. And it's also certainly something that Shakespeare does in his history plays. You know, if you know that a good chunk of your audience already know the history, then you can kind of play with that and exploit that. So, you know, you have a character like Jane Seymour who comes on and doesn't really do much in this novel, but you know she's big later on and you know what's coming. Why Wolf Hall beyond that? I mean, it's in some ways, I mean, we're sort of reaching beyond this novel to the rest of the series. I mean, Wolf Hall and the Seymours is, when we reach that point in the history, that's sort of where Cromwell's career begins to unravel. So in some ways that sort of looks forward not just to the rise of Jane Seymour, but to the decline of Cromwell. I also happen to, I mentioned various, I feel guilty calling them Catholic articles, but you know, I mean, they're by professedly Catholic writers in the Catholic journal First Things. And one of these that I was reading was arguing for a kind of psychoanalytic reading of Hilary Mantel. This was one also that called her basically a heretic and a blasphemer, but was trying to say that there were aspects of Wolf Hall that sort of aligned with Hilary Mantel's own story. I guess she comes from a sort of troubled background, and her father left her and her mother took up with another man. And anyway, I really don't want to get into that too much, but it might, who knows? I mean, if you subscribe to that kind of psychological reading, maybe there's something in that. But it's a good question, you know.
Absolutely. So one question you touched on a little bit earlier, but question we received in advance was, would Thomas Cromwell be considered one of the most successful, perhaps influential statesmen, along with Cicero, for example?
Another great question. And I should say, I mean, this is Dermot McCulloch's book, which, you know, if you're at all interested in Cromwell, I mean, he's a brilliant historian. I don't know how he manages. He seems to produce one of these doorstops of a book every few years. But this is now, I think, without question, the definitive biography of Thomas Cromwell. And he is really arguing that he was one of the most important figures in English history. I don't think the comparison with Cicero is necessarily a good one. I'm not an expert on Cicero, but I mean, we think of Cicero as one of the great statesmen, and we think of him as a kind of, well, I mean, he was, during the whole Renaissance period, the model for Latin style. You know, if you were a schoolboy and wanted to learn Latin, what you were taught was Ciceronian Latin because he was considered such a powerful, great orator. That's not Cromwell. I mean, Cromwell is a statesman in a different kind of way. And I think I think that's what Dermot would argue, that his greatness is of a different kind. He's not somebody who makes speeches. He's not a public. He's not in some ways even really a public figure. He's behind the scenes. He's a bureaucrat. He's a calculator. He's a numbers man. And that, I think, is where his enormous strength lies, that he basically revolutionizes the government of the United Kingdom, or, well, what at that point is at best Great Britain. But that before that, it's a relatively, from a modern perspective, a relatively primitive system, right? Parliament hasn't quite gotten even into its own. Any kind of major expense, certainly, the major expense that always crops up is war. Any war requires an enormous amount of money, which always causes problems because there isn't a lot of money. There isn't a standing army. Henry, of course, as a king, spends an enormous amount of money himself, which is a problem. And in a way, Cromwell's most important revolution is financial, that he systematizes the bureaucracy behind the monarchy, behind the aristocracy. He makes it pay in all sorts of ways that we might think of as unpleasant, right? He doesn't begin this, but he certainly charges ahead with dissolving all of the monasteries in England. The monasteries are, in a sense, redundant after the Reformation anyway, because the orders that they're supported by are dissolved, so that the various orders like Dominicans and Franciscans and Carthusians are kicked out of England, and so the monarchies don't have a function anymore. But a lot of them have an enormous amount of money connected with them, and property. And Cromwell sort of rakes that into the state, into the royal coffers, and that's partly what pays for it. But he's also, he's not just sort of like gathering cash. He's systematizing, he's structuring, he's making sure that there are systems in place. And so that's the kind of politician he is. It's really sort of structural, financial, bureaucratic, which I think, as I say, I'm not an expert on Roman history, but my sense is that Cicero's greatness, whatever it is of a different sort. That he's more of the sort of statesman and orator than Cromwell.
Susan said Cromwell was a policy wonk. Is that a fair description?
That's an interesting question. Well, maybe in a certain way. If you could somehow combine a policy wonk with a little bit of that, what Greenblatt calls the sort of, head of secret police. Cromwell also, my sense of him is that there is something, ruthlessly pragmatic about Cromwell. So he's not the sort of person who's fussing around with abstract ideas. For him, it's very much on the ground, boots on the ground. He is very much interested in policy, but not abstractly. It's all practical, and tends to involve particular people too. That's obviously another part of his gifts, is that he's able to figure people out right up and down the social scale, judge their strengths and their weaknesses, and put them to use in ways that are appropriate to both of those.
I was so interested while reading this. I think I was sort of trying to figure out what Mantel's doing and sort of where she's getting us to sympathize. And I was really struck by just Cromwell's competence, that I was like, I'm rooting for this guy because he's really competent and clever, and he understands how to play this game.
It's true. And he's surprising, I think, even whatever you think of him, he's an unusual character. It's true what she says. He comes out of nowhere, like he's born on the wharfs in Putney. His father it doesn't seem as if his father was quite as much a brute as Mantel makes out. But, he comes from that quarter, he's like a street kid. And then he ends up in Europe, not doing some kind of aristocratic grand tour, but working as a soldier. He's like punching his way around, learning how to fight, learning how to scrap and stay alive. And then he somehow works his way into the banking system, which is just developing in this period, international banking with these major Italian houses. He's got all this weird set of skills, thinking of this sort of silly movie with Liam Neeson, I have a particular set of skills. I mean, he has all the skills. He can fight, he can scrap, he can calculate. He has this amazing memory. He's gifted in languages. I mean, he obviously, that's another thing about his trips in Europe. I mean, he knows all of the European languages as well as classical languages. Certainly he knows Latin, which you have to know in order to deal internationally. And also, I mean, he's somebody who seems to have a genuine interest in the sort of religious ferment at the time. I mean, it's not incidental for him. He's got a real commitment to Protestantism, to what becomes sort of English Protestantism.
So along those lines, we have a question from Susan. So it was interesting to me that there was so much going on in England and Europe that impacted the story of Henry VIII becoming head of the Church of England, such as Tyndale and his translation of the Bible to English. Why was that such a threat?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting story. I mean, and it's a peculiar thing because England, the vernacular Bible is something that is, I mean, it's an issue. It's something that happens all over Europe. I mean, but it has a peculiar history in England for one reason, and that is because back in the 14th century, during the age of Geoffrey Chaucer, a churchman named John Wycliffe had a number of radical reforming ideas. Some of them were religious, theological, some of them had to do with the organization of the church, some of them were political, and a number of them were actually, in some ways, kind of prescient, or at least sort of foreshadowed the ideas that 16th century Protestant reformers would have. One of Wycliffe's strong beliefs was that the Bible should be available to everybody in English, or in the language that they could speak and read it in. And so Wycliffe and his followers, whatever else they were up to, were translating the Bible and circulating copies of the English Bible in manuscript. Because of Wycliffe's other radical ideas, the translation of the Bible became associated with radicalism. And so just shortly after his death, the translation of the Bible was declared not just illegal, but heretical. And that was unique across Europe. I know nowhere else in Europe was it considered a crime or a sin to translate the Bible. Church authorities, in some places or another, frowned on them. Sometimes they didn't. But in England, weirdly, at the beginning of the 16th century, it was still not just a crime, but heretical to translate the Bible without authorization. And so when William Tyndale decides that he's going to set to this, and he's following in the footsteps of Martin Luther, whom he was reading, he is doing something really very radical and dangerous. He tried to get permission for it in England, but he ends up having to sort of flee to the continent and do his translating in the Netherlands. And eventually he's caught there and executed for heresy. But it's a strange sort of thing. And it's also deeply, there's a kind of tragic irony especially about Tyndale, because only a few years after Tyndale is executed in 1536, Henry VIII authorizes the English translation of the Bible. So, if he'd managed to hide out for just a few more years, he would have perhaps had a long and happy life, because his translations then get incorporated into the Bibles that Henry authorizes. And as a lot of scholars have pointed out, a good deal of what becomes spread all over everywhere in the English-speaking world in the King James Bible is the work of William Tyndale, who died for it.
So Susan said, I was surprised by all the humor that Mantel puts into the book. Does that make the dry parts more digestible?
I suppose we'd have to sort of pin down what you think of the dry parts. And see, I mean, I think for my money, I think that's the gift that, well, I don't want to use the word gift, but I mean, what Mantel really achieves more than any of, I mean, as I said, there are tons of different fictionalized versions of Tudor history, from, including the sort of silly kind of soft porn tutors show that was running for a while and has sort of spun into various other things. Like isn't there like there's a Mary Queen of Scots film, or anyway. Mantel really makes this world come alive. And I think part of that is humor, sure, that she, she takes these characters. This is partly what I was saying in terms of, trying to bring history alive. Even historians do this, right? I mean, there are things we know about Cromwell, about Henry VIII, about, all of these other characters, but there's an enormous amount we don't know, but that surely existed. Like, it's not unreasonable to think that many of these people had a sense of humor, or that they had certain appetites or things that they enjoyed, or certain, unusual pleasures or hobbies or what have you. And by sort of rounding these characters, I think Hilary Mantel takes us into the narrative in a way that we might not, be drawn into in a more straightforward history. I think that the humor is certainly part of it. Although the humor is, it's a strange world, from a 21st century American perspective. I mean, part of, I think, what Greenblatt is getting at when he likens Cromwell to Berea is that it is a totalitarian state. I mean, Henry VIII is actually in control of England to a much more, in a much more absolute sense than Stalin was in control of the Soviet Union. His word is law. He can execute people left and right as he chooses. And it's a dangerous world, and a world in which the political and the personal are sort of weirdly intertwined. So, you have relationships with these people at court, and you go hunting with them, and you dance with them, and you sing songs with them, and you laugh with them. But it's all political too, so that the person you're sort of chuckling with at one moment may be the person who turns you in the next and is responsible for you ending up in the tower. So I don't know if I'm breaking Clara's rules here, but there's a sort of naughty story about Henry VIII that I remember hearing at a conference once, that when Henry and his entourage entered a room at court at one point, a courtier, a more minor courtier, let out an enormous fart. And there's this pause where, like, your life is, flashing before your eyes. And this quick thinking courtier turned to Henry and said, "Your Majesty, I was simply trumpeting your arrival." And Henry apparently got the joke and laughed, and all was well. But it's like, you're just teetering on the brink there. And what becomes a sort of hilarious joke could just as easily have become, there's later in the 16th century, another actually far more powerful person, the Earl of Oxford, had a similar embarrassing moment in front of Queen Elizabeth, and he was banished from court for years. He just became suddenly a persona non grata. So be careful. That's the model there.
Fair enough. I was wondering if you could, sort of returning to your conversation about historical fiction, talk a little bit about the critical reception to the novels. It won Man Booker Prize, but what's sort of within the literary fictional world, not fictional world, but world of literary fiction and sort of critical acclaim, what is the reputation of historical fiction? And
it's a great question. I'm a little out of my depth here, because even though the history that she's writing about is very much in my period, I spend most of my time researching Renaissance literature. But I've been reading around about this, and my sense is that not a lot has been written, but that some scholars have been interested in what they see as a kind of revival of historical fiction in the 21st century. That, if you think about modernist literature from the beginning of the 20th century and what dominates then through into the middle, popular novels in America and Britain and elsewhere, there's, what gets celebrated by, academics and critics and prizes is not primarily historical novels. But now you have Hilary Mantel, who, twice in a row gets the Booker Prize for and clearly historical novels. And then there are tons of other historical novels that people are writing that have become very popular. And that's an interesting, it's a question I don't have a ready answer to. I don't know why there might be a sort of return to history. I mean, does it have something to do with, it must have something to do with our own times. Does history fulfill a certain need? Is there a sense of sort of, is there an element of, especially since history, this history goes back 400 years, is there a kind of nostalgia? It's hard to imagine a sort of nostalgia for a time when, people get executed for all sorts of things, but maybe, I don't know. What is it? I'd be interested, many of you probably, I assume that you're tuning into this because you read and enjoyed this novel. And why is it that you found a historical novel of particular interest? And I suppose it depends too on the nature of the history. Maybe you're not a historical novel fan, but you just like this historical novel more than others, which is sort of what those critics I was citing were mentioning, right? That they were saying that, it's not as if all historical novels are great, but what you have with Hilary Mantel are great novels that happen to also be historical novels. So, interesting thing.
Susan asked, are the other two books in the trilogy as good as Wolf Hall?
I think people disagree about this, and that's fine. My own sense, I haven't spent a lot of time sort of doing like thumbs up or down or rankings of things, but my own sense is that the second novel sort of dips a little bit maybe, but that the third one ends really strong. There's such an enormous amount of material in it that it kind of sweeps you along. And by the time you get to the end, it really, there is a kind of neat, apparently, I can't remember how it is. The end of the final novel takes you back to the very beginning of the first novel in a certain way Cromwell's experience. One of the most powerful things of the first novel is that amazing opening where, you begin with like Cromwell having been like bludgeoned, is down on the ground, sort of stunned, looking across the stones at like what his father's boots and things like that, and try to sort out where he is and what's going on and whether he's going to die or not. And the novel, in a way, the trilogy sort of takes you back there at the end when Cromwell is facing the block and having similar sorts of thoughts. So it works. It's not a, you sometimes get the sense with like trilogies of novels as if, it's just economics, they're just trying to spin it out and make lots of cash, get more movie rights. But I think Hilary Mantel did clearly conceive this as a 3-novel set when she set out, for what that's worth.
So David said, what struck me most about the novels, but especially the first one, was Mantels' effectiveness in putting us inside the head of someone whose worldview is clearly so different from the worldview of today. So obviously we don't have any way to know whether her portrayal is accurate, but is your impression that she captured the Tudor period worldview believably?
I think so, yeah. And I don't have to just say this myself, but I mentioned Dermot McCulloch, who really is, as he's one of the preeminent historians of this period, and he's written tons of stuff about it, especially the sort of religious world of the Reformation. He wrote a biography of Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop, who plays a big role in it, and he's now produced a biography of Thomas Cromwell. And he is strongly in favor of Mantel's take on this and praises her historical research, her insights into the period, and the way she sort of represents even the most everyday kinds of scenes. I think it's very vivid. I don't feel, I've spent a lot of time reading Renaissance literature and Renaissance history of the period, and I didn't have the sense in various points of sort of like, those sort of ouch moments where and especially in sort of like cheesier TV or movie representations of, Queen Elizabeth I, where you just think, that doesn't happen in Mantel. You really feel like you're in the world, looking out through Cromwell's eyes, especially. I found that really interesting. Even if you ultimately decide that her representation of some specific aspect of Cromwell or Henry VIII or Thomas More isn't accurate, I think it's one to respect. You know, it's not sort of idle or just made up. There's some basis for it.
I was wondering if you could speak more to as well, sort of the way Mantel plots out sort of all this history and all these political things that are happening onto the structure of a novel to make it sort of a cohesive piece of literature in its own right. And kind of if there is any sort of details that are diminished or maybe exaggerated to fit onto the structure of the novel, or if you could speak to that.
No, that's a really interesting question, and I think you could do this in more detail. I haven't sat down and sort of mapped this out, but in rereading it, I was noticing, for instance, how she gets into the history that, we begin. I mean, she takes us, for instance, well, I mean, I'm thinking about, I guess, the analogy to Shakespeare's history plays. Famously, in his plays about the Wars of the Roses, he represents different worlds, so that you move back and forth from the world of the court, which is the world of sort of politics and power and what we would really call history proper. That's what you read in the history books. He moves from that world to the world of the taverns and the streets and these sort of low-life characters who aren't part of the historical record, but who give us a really valuable sort of alternate perspective on life, right? I mean, they're in fact the people who make up the majority of mankind, right? I mean, most of us don't make it into history books. You read about Henry VIII and Cromwell and Thomas More, but like the majority of English people are just trying to get on with their lives. And I think Mantel does a good job of sort of similarly like moving us into the court, and we have, major political issues or discussions between the major players that we recognize as connecting to sort of the big events. But then we go back to smaller things, and we have, Cromwell sort of dealing with issues of his family, or ordinary people who don't make it into the history books, but who obviously Cromwell cares about. That's something actually that Dermot McCulloch supports. He says that one documentable quality of Cromwell is that he remembered everybody and he was loyal to people. So he's loyal, obviously, to Cardinal Wolsey, who's his first great sort of boss, mentor, supporter, but he's loyal to little people too. So, if he has a relationship with some small person, he has a relationship with the jailer in the tower, at the end, and he remembers these people and he does favors for them and he looks out for them. And later in life, he hasn't heard from them for decades, but they'll send him a letter saying, I'm in dire straits and I need X, and he'll send the money or arrange for something like that. And a lot of that sort of little stuff, I think, makes a huge difference. And that's, I think, that's got to be part of the way she structures the book, that she's sort of moving us sort of in and out of the sort of big historical world. She also, I mean, this is how narrative works, right? That one of the techniques for making a story interesting is not telling it sort of linearly. So, she plunges us into something and then takes us back. We begin, for instance, already at the point where Henry is clearly about to moving on from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. So anything about that, their first marriage and how that happened, and Catherine and her background, has to be told sort of in retrospect and catching us up. And similarly with Cromwell too, we get sort of bits and pieces of his story. We start out with him as a kid sort of beaten up on the ground. At various points, we get those other parts of his life story filled in, but not in a linear way. We jump to him with Wolsey, and then we only find out later on about what happened when he was on the continent and how did he get the various sort of skills and knowledge that he got. So I think she keeps us moving in interesting ways, and she's got such an enormous cast of characters too that she can kind of shift around. We spend time with the court ladies, for instance, or with the Queen and her entourage, but then we've got Thomas More, and we've got the various sort of churchmen and the main figures of state in Henry's Privy Council, hunting expeditions. I think one of the elements I love in the novels is this weird relationship that Cromwell has with the emperor's ambassador, Chapuis. that even though officially, it's a total failure. I mean, Cromwell has no interest in kowtowing to the emperor, and Chapuis is frustrated by almost everything that goes on. They sort of bond together, and so they share these meals, and they like send food and drink back and forth, and they chat sort of into the night about about what's going on. That's very cool. I like that. It's yeah, it was an interesting way of sort of humanizing the history.
And kind of along those lines, do you think Thomas More has to be portrayed the way he is in order for Cromwell's sort of competence and character to be portrayed the way it is?
Well, maybe. I mean, that's an interesting question. Is it a sort of like, are they sort of, it's like sort of two buckets, one goes up, one goes down. Maybe. I mean, I think one of the things probably that, I mean, I don't know if she was sort of consciously doing this, but in some of the earlier historical representations of this period, Thomas More is represented as like, Superman. There's a famous play by Robert Bolt called A Man for All Seasons that then got turned into a film with, who was in it? Robert Shaw played King Henry. I'm trying to remember who played Paul Schofield, my wife and sort of database is reminding me over there. But that film, you come away thinking like Thomas More is just like the greatest man who's ever lived, and that England like went to pot, and the Reformation was just a horrible thing. Henry trying to sort of wreak his will on the English people and shattering the church, and only More stands up and heroically dies. I think it's worth swinging the pendulum back a little bit. Because I mean, More, and another of the things about Thomas More is that most of us know him best as the author of the Utopia, which he wrote sort of earlier on. He coined the term utopia, and it's the first utopian sort of fiction. He's kind of imagines this ideal society, this island out in the middle of the place. And I mean, it's a hugely influential book. A lot of people, people have been reading it for centuries. But that's not by any means the only Thomas More. I mean, he was deeply into religious controversy. He wrote enormous, vicious tracts against Martin Luther and also, and especially Tyndale. Tyndale and More were sort of hurling volumes at each other for a number of years. And More, I mean, even if I don't know enough to know whether the charges of him personally torturing heretics have any substance, but as I say, he certainly wouldn't have disapproved of it. And that, I think, ought to complicate our sense of his character. I mean, if Cromwell has his ruthless and dangerous and questionable side, Thomas More certainly does too. It's a dangerous time, and these are not necessarily comfy, cozy guys. And so I think, even if we might not go quite as far as Hilary Mantel, it's worth thinking about what it takes to be successful in this kind of a world. You notice that, I mean, most of the people who are genuinely good and innocent are just flotsam and jetsam. I mean, they're the ones who end up, getting caught and burned alive, sadly.
So as a scholar, how do kind of works like Wolf Hall and all these other books and movies and TV adaptations that you discussed, sort of how does this affect the public perception of the work that you do?
It's a great question. No, a really interesting question. And I mean, I guess I'm of sort of different minds. I mean, there's certainly sometimes when I gnash my teeth, and I'm sure, other people like me do the same. You see some silly movie and you think, why bother? I mean, especially when it was a movie called, what was it called? I can't even remember it, but that's okay. I don't want to encourage you to see it. So, but it was about, it was sort of following this kind of alternative authorship theory. I mean, there's this sort of weird conspiracy theory that Shakespeare didn't write his own works. And so there was a big film that sort of explored this, and, it drove me nuts. But in another way, I suppose, there is, if people get interested in the period enough to actually try to figure out what really went on, maybe that's a good thing. And the truth is that it's not as, as I said at the very beginning of this session, it's not as if there is one single true history of the period. So to some extent, every telling of the story is going to have some kind of a slant. It's going to have to take some kind of a position. Shakespeare himself, I teach Shakespeare's history plays. I love them, but they're not reliable as historical representations. They're plays. They're exciting. They're dramatic, but he changes the history when he wants to. Sometimes it works very well for him in terms of what he can stage. Sometimes he has to, change characters, change timelines. This famous is Richard III. One of the powerful characters is Queen Margaret, who actually was long dead by the time the action of the play starts. But that doesn't bother him so much. She's a great character. It's a sort of give and take. I can't come down too hard on the contemporary novels and films without, at the same time as saying, well, Shakespeare's, he can do it. He can do that, but Hilary Mantel can't. Mantel, I should say, by the way, she said this like 100 times in interviews that she stresses again and again and again that she's not writing history, she's writing a novel. She doesn't want she has no sense that people are going to take this as history. She's writing a fictionalized version, take it as you will.
The portrayal of Thomas More in Wolf Hall really reminded me of the portrayal of Joan of Arc in Henry VI plays.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, and Joan of Arc, there's another figure, who's been, there's been all sorts of like novels and plays and films. Was it like Lily Sobieski was Joan of Arc in one film or TV series? And they take different tacks. Shakespeare is not terribly sympathetic because, the English, well, I was going to say in Shakespeare's day, but it's pretty much universal. The English and the French never get along. So by and large, the French are bad in Shakespeare's history plays. But there are a lot of other tellings of that story where Joan is a hero, is one of the great, is a saint, as she is. So it's the same kind of thing. Yeah, it's is More a good guy, is More a bad guy? Well, he's probably some combination of both, like most of us.
Susan said, I was impressed by all the steps it took for Henry to become head of the church and how long it took. It was so much more than Henry waking up one morning and assuming this role. I had never thought about the fact that this had never happened before. In history, Henry and Cromwell invented the role for Henry.
That's interesting. No, it's true. And they are really inventing this as they go along. I suppose another aspect of that is that, and this I think is again part of this sort of complexity of things. Henry VIII was clearly. I have a friend and colleague who is a Tudor historian, and she hates teaching Henry VIII because she just thinks he's a monster. And I think she's right. He is a monster. He's horrible. He's nasty, but he's also sort of weirdly compelling sometimes, and even kind of there are these moments in the novel where it's sort of you realize he's a monster, but he's sort of somehow charming. He's playing with kids or puppy dogs or singing or something. But one thing that a lot of the fictional versions leave out, and I think even Mantel doesn't give you as much as she should or could. Henry really cared about, even if he was partly trying to divorce his first wife so he could marry someone else and get an heir, he also genuinely cared about these religious issues. He read theology, he read the Bible and thought about these things so that it's not as if he's not purely Machiavellian. He cares. And so when he is trying, when he's looking for a way out, he is looking for a way out. He wants, with Cranmer, with Cromwell, to find a legitimate way of doing what he wants to do. There have to be grounds to divorce Catherine, right? Just as there have to be grounds to condemn Anne. They're obviously a bit trumped up, but then similarly, how can we legitimately argue that, England, that the king is the head of the English church? And they come up with arguments. They come up with precedents. They come up with, with religious arguments, and then they can use that. He doesn't simply say, okay, just do it. I don't care. He does care. He wants his way, but he wants his way to be a way that he feels is also persuasive. reasonable.
Absolutely. Well, we're drawing to the end of our hour. Hannibal, did you want to share any closing thoughts, parting words for everyone?
Well, one thing that hasn't come up, and I don't know if, I mean, obviously, there are probably a long list of questions, given how many of us are online, but one of the things that a lot of people have commented on is Mantel's style, which is, especially her habit. I mean, she writes in what is known as free and direct discourse. So she's writing in the third person rather than the first person. Thomas Cromwell isn't writing like an autobiography, but she's writing in the third person from his perspective. So in a weird way, even though she's writing in the third person, you sort of forget that sometimes. And you feel that you're kind of looking at the world through Cromwell's eyes. But she has this sort of odd way of like, she wrote about this, like, I mean, I have this comment from her, from Mantel. She says, the events were happening now in the present tense, unfolding as I watched. And what followed would be filtered through the main character's sensibility. He seemed to be occupying the same physical space as me, with a slight ghostly overlap. It didn't make sense to call him Cromwell as if he were somewhere across the room. I called him he. So she's continually like he, and sometimes that gets sort of disturbing or confusing. And sometimes she does throw in that Cromwell. So you have like he Cromwell, which sounds sort of weird. But I think the ultimate effect may work. It's sort of a judgment call. I mean, I don't know whether you all felt that it worked, but I mean, what she's obviously trying for is a particular style that allows her to take you inside his head in an unusual way. And it's interesting that she, I mean, she's obviously somebody who's very conscious of literary craft, and I think that's kind of intriguing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Hannibal, for sharing your time and expertise for us. A big virtual round of applause from everyone.
Take care.